I think today marks a really important moment with the first meeting of the PAREA Alliance, the Psychedelic Access and Research European Alliance. And with the lineup of speakers, we really wanted to give a first insight on the potential for new therapies in this domain. Another host of today is, as you rightly said, MEP Saliba. And I know we've got a video message from him be with us today. So I don't know if the video message can be
Good afternoon, everyone. I regret that I cannot be with you today in person, since this week I am attending the S&D external meeting in Vienna. Good mental health and well-being have been amongst my key priorities since day one as a member of the European Parliament. For several years I have been co-chairing the MEP Alliance for Mental Health. The Alliance Secretariat is provided by Gamian Europe, and I was pleased to learn that Gamian is one of PAREA founding members. At one of the MEP Alliance meetings just before COVID, I called upon the European Commission to prioritize mental health and also develop a European Union mental health strategy. The Commission started to listen. Earlier this year, its President, the Commission, President Ursula von der Leyen, announced that mental health will become an EU health priority and will see a comprehensive approach in the years to come. I'm encouraged by these developments in much the same way that I'm encouraged by the scientific progress surrounding using psychedelic compounds in the treatment of mental health conditions. In conjunction with proper psychological support, they hold the potential to provide safe, rapid-acting and robust clinical improvements and durable effects. And I do not have to convince anyone that we badly need more treatment options for people affected by mental ill health. My understanding is that it is likely that psychedelic-assisted therapies might be approved by regulators in the US as soon as 2024, and approvals in Europe will definitely follow suit. In this context, the EU prioritization of mental health couldn't be timelier, and you can rest assured that I will be actively calling upon the EU institutions to include the area of psychedelic novel therapies in the wider mental health agenda. The European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction should be included in those efforts, and together with my other MEP colleagues, we are working on a cross-party request to the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction to provide us with an evidence-based assessment on the current state of play in the field of psychedelic science to inform us about further action. I wish you a successful event, and PAREA can count on my support. Thank you.
Okay, and obviously, thanks to MEP Saliba for the support that he just expressed. I just would like to invite our first speaker after this round of introduction, who is Pedram Dara. And Pedram participated in a phase 2 clinical trial for a PTSD psychedelic-assisted therapy. So, Pedram, your bio is available for everyone, but I think it would be way more eloquent if you can maybe lead us through the let's say your course and your background, and explain what you'd like to share with us today.
Sure. Thank you very much. First, I want to thank. Yeah. Well, thanks everyone for being here. First of all, thank you to Tadeusz for organizing this and giving importance to the voice of patients and participants. So my name is Pedram, and basically my story begins, came to Canada in 2004 as a refugee. And during that experience of coming to Canada, and also my entire life prior to that, I experienced many traumatic events. Fortunately, didn't seek any sort of treatment, and I lived on for about 15 years, just, with different coping mechanisms, started by, work and success and money, and then, changed to, relationships. And, I just changed different coping mechanisms rather than actually going after the root cause. And that kept on until about I think I was 34, 35, and I became a father. I think the lack of sleep and just, having that life-changing experience really pushed my mental health, even further down to the level that I couldn't maintain work. So I would change jobs, or, I couldn't stay really productive. All of my relationships started hurting, including the one with my wife. My parents, all friends, eventually became very isolated, experiencing what I thought was depression, to the level that I completely lost hope, and I would say definitely became suicidal. I just couldn't see a way through this. And on one hand, I'm a new father, I have this beautiful little girl, and I'm supposed to enjoy this experience, and everything on the outside looked good, but inside I was kind of dead. I couldn't really even experience joy. Situation kept getting worse, unfortunately, and one day, which was, I think, probably my bottom, I would say my rock bottom moment, where I used to experience a lot of rage episodes. I would just get really angry over small things, and one day I exploded so badly that unfortunately fortunately I didn't become that violent, but this time I think I met the border of that, and I got so mad at home that I just threw a plate of food to the wall and just broke to pieces. And then my wife just grabbed my daughter and ran away from the house to find safety. And I think that was a kind of like wake up moment for me, where I felt like, okay, like I'm definitely in trouble and I need to seek help. As a way to distract myself from sitting with those feelings and doing anything, I started looking at my phone, and I'm scrolling through. I randomly see an article about MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. Back then, I thought MDMA was a party drug and PTSD was for soldiers. I didn't see the connection between the two. Next thing you know, I learned more about it, and I found out there was a study happening in the city that I was living. And story short, that process took 4 or 5 months, but eventually I was lucky enough to be accepted at that study. Only 6 other people before me had received this treatment before. So I felt very lucky to be accepted in the study. Changed my life, to say the least. Definitely gave me a new sense of hope that I was looking for, and a potential for healing. The study ended in early 2019. Then from there on, I kind of went beyond the diagnosis. I took charge of my own healing journey, especially because the current research protocols really lack post-treatment support, which was something that I was missing a lot. So I had to kind of take charge of that on my own. And the journey still continues. I mean, I'm here, I can speak about this experience, but by all means, I still have my issues. I still struggle from time to time, and I have moments that I fall down, but I definitely get up quicker. I somehow haven't lost that hope. So it's kind of an upward spiral, I would say. I'm happy to report that. Then I want to share a few lessons that I learned through this experience. I think psychedelics are kind of like tools and technologies. My own background is in technology, so this is how I made sense of my healing journey, that I think they're great for solving problems, especially they have massive potential for the speed and the scale of the mental health crisis that we're all facing. And obviously with COVID, things are even worse now. Yet at the same time, I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all solution. I also don't think it's for everybody. And I think one of the first things we need to figure out is who are the best people for this sort of treatments. And lastly, it's not a cure, it's a catalyst. That's how I see it. It definitely initiated my own healing journey, but it's not a magical pill you take and all your problems go away. A few things that we lack, in my opinion and experience, is that we lack infrastructure and accessibility and sufficient aftercare. We also lack public, be very relevant for the room we are in, because, we like it or not, it has already extractive capitalism because of the hype. And I think more public funding could tackle that. Lastly, a few things that I think action points, I think definitely there's still a stigma, both around mental health conditions, talking about it, as well as psychedelics themselves. So I think if one thing we could all do is by kind of like removing that stigma, it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to seek alternative treatments. And I hope we can do more in that. So we definitely need more resources. My hope is that we make mental health care a fundamental human right and making it accessible to everybody. And I say that because at this given moment in my home country back in Iran, people are being traumatized in number of thousands in a given moment because of the uprising. And I hope Europe doesn't continue to be a garden and leave the jungle alone. And I hope that what happens in Europe could have an impact outside of Europe also. Lastly, I think the voice of patients and participants definitely need to be addressed and be at the center of this innovation. I had an opportunity of actually organizing a participant panel at the ICPR conference this year, which was very well received. And I think the lived experience is something that we need to share more of. And then lastly, I hope we can transform the society also that is actually causing the trauma and suffering. Because if you only focus on the trauma and suffering alone, then yeah, we might improve our treatments. But if the world is still an unsafe place, then we'll continue to have people becoming traumatized and having mental health conditions. And kind of the analogy that I like to use is that let's assume we are having a lot of car accidents and people show up in the emergency rooms with broken limbs and arms. And if all we are doing is improving the treatments, but leaving the roads unsafe, then are we really solving the problem? And my hope is that we do both. That while we continue to improve our treatments, we also make the world a safer place to begin with.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pedram, particularly for conveying this, let's say, very personal token and your lived experience. I also wanted to reflect on what you said about it's not a cure, but a catalyst. In your case, you were saying it was life-changing to go through this experience. Still, I mean, were there any challenges that you faced in the process? Or what would be, let's say, the most challenging, let's say, step that you had to go through, even with the psychedelic support in your therapy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest challenge was this notion of it's not my fault, but it's my responsibility. Mm-hmm. Because it was so easy to just blame everyone. I started by blaming my parents for everything, and then the society as a whole and all that. And then eventually I had this cold hard truth of like, okay, definitely was a lot of things that happened to me wasn't my fault, but the healing is my responsibility. And I think just accepting that and really owning it and almost becoming interested in my own healing. So rather than like, here's this mental health conditions that is really like, almost rather than seeing it as an enemy, I was like, okay, like, let me just actually grow some interest and make this the biggest project of my life. And that was perhaps the most challenging thing actually to go through.
Yeah, thank you. Would like this meeting to be a lively one and one where you have your say also and where you can contribute. So participants online are really welcome to put their questions into the chat. We have a way here to collect questions. Sorry in advance if we cannot deal with all of them, given how attended or how well attended this afternoon is. But if in the room anyone would like to speak up, simply wave at me and I'll give you the floor. But otherwise, I'll move on with our speakers, and feel free to come back also to Pedram whenever you'd like to ask a question to one of our next speakers. Because next is Parea founder and executive director, Tadeusz Awrot, and your task to introduce to us what Parea stands for. So you've got the floor.
Great. Thank you, Fred. Let's see just if this will work. A few more tries. Maybe this. So I might need to have the slides changed by the magic word next. Okay, so if we come back to the previous one.
So we come back to the pre-COVID time. COVID learned you're on mute, and before COVID it was next. So
True.
we're back to normal then.
Yeah, okay, so good to be back in normal. And I will speak about Parea, obviously, and also about why we think that the time is now to start preparing for safe and effective psychedelic-assisted therapies in Europe. So I think a good place to start is with massive unmet needs that we see in the area of psychedelic-assisted therapies and in the area of brain disorders. And I think that brain disorders really are unmet needs par excellence. We can go next, please. Next, let's see if this works. Well, anyway, I will speak and well, maybe we'll catch up with slides. So we, in fact, when we look at just the prevalence of mental health conditions, over 80 million, and alcohol use disorder, 23 million Europeans being addicted, this is already more than 100 million Europeans, and you know there are more conditions. And at the same time, we haven't really seen a lot of really breakthrough innovation in the area. For instance, since 2015, there were only 7 new neuropsychiatric drugs approved, whereas we've seen some 8 drugs approved in oncology. And in the last few decades, really, mostly what we've been doing is tweaking existing molecules. So there was a slow, kind of painfully slow pharmaceutical innovation happening. So against this backdrop, against this backdrop, we see this really truly groundbreaking scientific advances that are related to both psychedelic compounds and psychedelic-assisted therapies. And we'll hear more about that from the speakers today later on. And it's not just science, but also, and you can see here on the slide just how many clinical trials are happening now. In the last 10 years, there has been this tremendous increase, though it's always worth adding that this research started already in the 20th century and then went into a deep freeze because of the war on drugs, which, as some say, was the biggest kind of censorship of science. Next. And it's not just science, but there is also a lot of regulatory progress happening all over the world. And one example is that the US Food and Drug Administration granted so-called breakthrough therapy designation for free psychedelic-assisted therapies in the last few years. Next. So with all this, still these treatments are not approved because we do need more research, bigger sample sizes. We need really to use rigorous methodologies so that we can further understand and confirm safety and efficacy of those compounds, and also look into other treatments parameters such as the therapy itself. Next. So with this, while we are not sure about the treatment parameters, we are sure about one thing, or about the research, we are sure about one thing, and that is that European health systems are not prepared for these treatments yet. Next. And we are here as Parea to change it and to really offer advice and expertise of our members to EU policymakers so that we can start preparing for that. So Parea stands for Psychedelic Access and Research European Alliance, and it's also a Greek word, which means to be in the company of friends or to do something together. And in the Greek culture, Parea is a venue for the growth of the human spirit and the development of ideas to enrich our quality of life. And these are values that also guide our joint collaboration to change perceptions, to educate, to scale up and accelerate action, and of course, ultimately to bring better health to European citizens. Next. So Parea is all about our members. This is really our strength. We are this incredible partnership of a lot of groups. Many of them are active in Europe. Most importantly, we have several patient advocacy groups that are our founding members, patients covering the area of mental health, neurology, chronic pain. We also have professional associations like European College of Neuropsychopharmacology and European Psychiatric Association as a member. as well as a number of psychedelic patient organizations, SaiPan, and if we go next, several associate members, observers, and industry partners. So with this, we are becoming this collective voice of all kind of concerned psychedelics and mental health and brain disorders in Europe, and a one-stop shop for the EU policymakers. Next. Our vision is a world in which brain health is valued, preventable suffering is avoided, and psychedelic novel treatments help people to heal and enhance their sense of well-being. And this brings us to our mission, which you can see on the next slide. And this is safe, modern, and ethically responsible integration of those treatments into European mainstream health services. People should have them available within their existing healthcare frameworks at the place where they live, from the doctor and therapists they trust, and paid by health insurance. And on the next slide, you will see objectives that drive our progress. This is research, supporting drug reform, educating to decrease stigma, building capacity, collaboration, equitable, timely, affordable, safe, and legal access to those therapies, promoting meaningful engagement and safeguarding optimal care and safety for patients and trial participants, and contributing to a diverse and equitable psychedelic ecosystem. Now, I guess now you can just click a few times because there will be animations. Yes, so I want to speak about a tremendous progress that has been happening in terms of policy and regulation in the last few years, unfortunately, mostly outside Europe. And these are just examples from this year. We've seen this letter from National Institute of Health and Food and Drug Administration earlier this year, which spoke about NIH funding in 2021 for psychedelics amounting to $35 million. There were a couple of workshops organized at the federal level by federal agencies, 2-day workshops each. A few weeks ago, there was this initiative in the US Congress where they formed this bipartisan caucus, which is, I guess, a kind of equivalent to the MEP interest group here in Europe, where they will explore psychedelic research, steal the congressional conversation, and serve as an educational resource. Also, in closer to us in the UK, we've seen some regulatory incentives and developments, such as this innovation passport granted to MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, and also a grant from NICE to fund phase 3 trial for the ketamine use for the treatment of alcohol use disorder. So with this, I like to think about this saying that the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. And I think we have a bit of work to do in Europe to catch up and actually take the lead. I think we should aim at taking the lead in terms of policy and regulation in this area. And one more thing I want to mention on the next slide is another thing that was announced. So if you go next, earlier this year in the US, there was this letter from the US President Biden administration, which speaks about an anticipation of an approval of MDMA and psilocybin therapies within the next 2 years. And they are considering establishing a federal task force to address the numerous complex issues that are surrounding this therapeutic area, and establishing a public-private partnership where there will be a collaboration both across federal agencies as well as outside stakeholders. Next. So I think this is really something that we should get inspired by in Europe, because we have this unparalleled opportunity to address an area of such huge unmet needs. But it also comes with a lot of work and preparations we need to put. So we should formulate a similar initiative in the EU. And if you go next again. More concretely, at Parea, we believe that we need to start preparing to develop infrastructure for the highest quality, safe, affordable, and equitable access, good standards of practice, training of specialized therapists, their credentialing and licensing, safe and ethical use, supporting people with challenging experiences, as we know there will be challenging experiences, engaging with communities and peer support networks, so that once people go to treatments, they also have then a possibility to carry through with their healing process with their communities, and developing data standards. And it will be really best if we address this at the level of the European Union, rather than having individual countries working on this one by one and wasting resources, duplicating their efforts. We believe that the EU should provide a platform for member states to work together on developing these solutions. And also, very importantly, as we've foreseen that there will be a bottleneck in terms of available therapists who will be trained to assist people with these therapies, we might need to look at a phased rollout so that we can balance a need for widespread access with safety monitoring and supervision. And on the last slide, I just want to thank you and invite you to get involved, join us, support us, stay updated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tad. It's very clear in terms of presenting the Alliance vision, objectives, but also on the, as you said, the major unmet medical need that is actually in sight in developing those activities. If there are no questions, I'm quite eager to take the next 3 presentations in a row and then open the discussion instead of having the Q&A one by one, and that would certainly help having a more animated discussion. Particularly, as David, I would like to hear from you what it means in relation to mental health conditions. So Professor David Nutt is probably one we no longer need to introduce. You're the chair of Parea. You're former president of the European Brain Council, but you're also professor at Imperial College in Neuropsychopharmacology and founder of Drug Science. So David, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Fred. Next slide, please. I thought it might be just helpful to give a very brief historical overview of this field, because today, as was already mentioned, there was a lot of data collected in the last century, and that data is actually quite helpful to us currently, which I'll explain in a little while. But if we just start with the graph on the left-hand side, it shows the number of publications each year for LSD, the psychedelic LSD in blue, and psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, in pink. And you can see there's a massive increase in the number of publications going from the 1950s, when these drugs were made available, to 1970. And the blue arrow below shows that psilocybin was introduced into medicine as a therapy by Sandow in 1959. And LSD was made available in the little box, that's a box of LSD tablets, made available for researchers by Sandow back in 1953. And that massive increase in publications, which covered over 40,000 patients being studied, was fueled by research funded by the US government. And at that time, in the 50s and 60s, psychedelics were seen as the great revolution in psychiatric research and therapy. For the first time, we had tools that we could use to both explore the brain and also change the brain. And then the arrow points to the 1971 UN Convention, Psychotropics Convention, which effectively stopped all this research. And you can see there was a precipitate fall in the number of publications. And for some years, particularly for psilocybin, there were no publications at all. And this was, I think, a deliberate attempt by the international community, driven by the American war on drugs, to actually eliminate all knowledge of these drugs. Funding stopped. And even if you could get support from charities, access to the drugs became virtually impossible. And the driver for that was actually the war in Vietnam, and psychedelics, particularly LSD, were associated with the anti-war movement. You can see in the picture in the bottom right. And because the anti-war movement couldn't be banned itself, the drugs got banned. And what was really perverse, and there is no sensible explanation for this, is that they were banned for as well as being banned for recreational use. That, I think, is the worst censorship of research and certainly of clinical practice in the history of the world, because that ban still persists today. There is no country in the world that signed up to the 1971 convention that has undone it. Although, as you know, we are getting around it in research terms, but it's still, all these drugs are still illegal internationally. Next slide, please. And one of the justifications for putting psychedelics into Schedule 1 of the conventions was that they were very harmful, as well as having no medical value. Well, in the last 10 years, there have been 3 very detailed, systematic reviews of the harms of a range of different drugs, including psychedelics and also MDMA, which I'll talk about in a minute. The first one was the one published by Drug Science in The Lancet in 2010, and that's been replicated by a group of European experts funded by the Department of Justice in Europe in 2014, and a group of Australian experts in 2018. And you don't need to look at where the most, oops, could you go back, please? But in the red circles, you see the drugs we're talking about. You see LSD, psilocybin, magic mushrooms, and MDMA, and they all fall in the red circles. And you can see the red circles are at the lower end of harm. So these are harm scores. The taller the bar, the more harmful the drug is. And we have 3 independent groups of people estimating the harms of these drugs when used recreationally. And they turn out to be amongst the least harmful of all recreational drugs. And we know that when these drugs are used clinically, where you're using 1 or 2 or 3 doses at the most, the risks are even less. So the myth of harms have really been exploded over the last 10 years. And this is given an underpinning to the resurrection of research that many groups are doing now. Next slide, please. So those are psychedelics. And this slide just looks at the history of MDMA, which is not, though it's not a psychedelic, it's been similarly censored for research because of recreational use. And that image there is a stylized picture of the man who reinvented and rediscovered MDMA, Sasha Shulgin. There's the molecule in his hand, and he's with his wife. And Shulgin made a whole range of different amphetamine derivatives, as well as other psychedelic tryptamines. But when he tested MDMA on himself, like all good chemists do, he realized it had a peculiarly discrete and different effect to any other drug he'd ever tried. And he said it produced a clarity of thought and an empathy, which made it very different. So he shared it with his wife, who was a therapist. And she said, yes, this drug could be potentially a very useful tool for psychotherapy. And it was widely used by therapists, particularly in the west coast of the USA, for about 10 years. And tens of thousands of people were given it in therapy because it was a legal drug. But then 2 things happened. The first is it started being sold in clubs as a legal alternative to amphetamine, which was illegal, and encouraged people to dance and to become more empathetic with each other. But the worst thing of all was its name was changed, because originally it was called empathy, because that's what it does. But its name was changed to ecstasy to make it more appealing for recreational use. And that then made it become very popular. It moved from Texas, it moved into many parts of the States, it moved to Ibiza. The rave scene in Europe started. And there was a hysterical backlash, particularly because the media hated the idea that young people were having ecstasy, and it was made illegal. But there was one group of therapists in the States who carried on trying to resurrect it, and they're called MAPS, And they're now, after 30 years, they've managed to raise enough funding to take MDMA through into clinical trials. And that was one of the trials, the early trials that Hedron was talking about. The next slide, please. So let's just look at the latest clinical data, because there's been a tremendous explosion of really high quality data in the last few years. Next slide, please. And this, I think, is probably the seminal study that really kick-started this whole field. And this is a study we did and published in 2016. We started in 2012. It took a long time to get the drug. It was the study was delayed by the bureaucracy. We achieved this output. And this is a trial of psilocybin, a single dose, 25 milligram dose of psilocybin, given to people with resistant depression. They'd all failed on at least 2 antidepressants. Some had failed on over 10. They'd all failed on psychotherapy, CBT. And you can see they all got better. In fact, some of them got so well, they moved from being depressed to undepressed into the yellow bar at the bottom with no depression. In fact, some of them are still well now, 10 years later. Not many, but a quarter stayed well. 3/4, the depression started to creep back after 3 or 6 months. But nevertheless, even if you go out to the 3-month data, that is the most powerful single dose therapy for resistant depression there's ever been. And in fact, it's so powerful, it's initiated many of the companies that Tad showed you the graph of getting interested in this field, because this is potentially a revolution for treatment-resistant depression. And the good news is that it's been replicated. The next slide, please. And these are the data published just last month by Compass Pathways. So one of the companies that set up to try to take psilocybin from research into medicine was Compass Pathways. And here they did a remarkable study. This is a massive multi-center, randomized controlled trial of 3 different doses of psilocybin, a tiny dose, a 1 milligram dose, a middle dose, a 10 milligram dose, and the dose we use, the 25 milligram dose in blue. And if you look at the top left-hand curve, you see that one day after the high dose of psilocybin, there was a profound reduction in depression scores in these treatment-resistant patients. And you can see, if you look at the blue line in the top left, there's a significant benefit of that high dose over the lower doses. It goes out to 6 weeks. In fact, it, to some extent, continues up to 12 weeks. And look at the right-hand side of the slide. You see the percentage of people getting into what's called remission. And these are people that no longer have depression. They're effectively cured of their depression. And at week 12, you see a quarter of the people who had previously treatment-resistant depression were actually cured by just one single dose of psilocybin, 25 milligrams, 3 months before. So that, again, is a remarkable finding, unprecedented, really, in terms of psychiatry or psychiatric treatments of depression. The next slide, please. Now, while Compass Pathways were doing their work, we were doing a different study, which was to compare the efficacy of psilocybin versus the gold standard antidepressant escitalopram, an SSRI. And it's a complicated design. I haven't got time to go through it with you completely, but both groups got exactly the same amount of psychotherapy. Both groups got psilocybin, but the psilocybin group in red got a high dose. The escitalopram group in blue got a tiny dose, but they all had the same level of preparation and therapeutic support afterwards. And if you look at the top left-hand graph, you see the reductions in depression scores following the first dose and then following the second dose 3 weeks later of psilocybin. And you see that the red bars, the psilocybin group, did better across the board than the escitalopram group. But again, you see the profound, almost immediate reduction in depression scores following the psilocybin. And escitalopram did very well because there was a lot of psychotherapy around the start of the trial. What's interesting, though, is on the right-hand graph, this is the sort of the opposite of reductions in depression. This is increases in well-being. This uses a standardized scale called the Warwick, Edinburgh mental well-being scales. And you see again, after the first dose of psilocybin, there's a massive increase in well-being. Psilocybin much more powerfully increasing well-being than escitalopram. And this persists and may even go up with the second dose. And well-being is important because well-being probably protects against future risk of relapse. And the bottom left-hand table shows remission rates in this trial. Now that we use 4 separate scales, and you can see that the different scales give different remission rates for psilocybin and escitalopram. But when you compare the difference between the two, you see psilocybin is at least twice as good and sometimes 4 times as good as escitalopram, supporting the view that getting people fully well is more likely after psilocybin. Next slide, please. Other trials in other jurisdictions, particularly this trials in the USA from Johns Hopkins, and the graph at the top shows an interesting trial where people were randomized either to staying on a waiting list, which is the black blobs, or going on to psilocybin, the orange blobs. And you can see the psilocybin worked much better than waiting list. And their waiting list group would then switch to psilocybin. That's the right-hand graph, and they all got better. And there are also trials going on, and you'll hear a bit more about trials in addiction for smoking and alcohol dependence. And there are trials also going on in anorexia, OCD, and in pain syndromes. And you might say, why would a treatment with a psychedelic work across such a range of different disorders? And the answer is because they're all what we call internalizing disorders. They're all disorders in which individuals get locked into a ruminative way of thinking that they can't escape from. And I'll show you at the end the brain changes which underpin recovery from that. Next slide, please. What about the latest data with MDMA? So these are the data from the first of the MAPS phase 3 trials. And the second one has just been finished, and we're reporting later next year. But if it's as good as this one, which is likely, then there will be it's almost certain that MDMA will be a medicine, because you can see in the left-hand box the remarkable difference between standard therapy, which is established therapy for PTSD in the blue line, and the same therapy in the red line with 3 doses of MDMA. And those 3 doses produce much greater reductions in the scores for PTSD than the therapy with placebo, which was saline. And you can see this on the right-hand image. So you see 3 circles on the right-hand side. You see an image, the black circle, of the proportion of people who met criteria for PTSD before treatment, and everyone did, because that's how they got into the trial. They had PTSD and they had not responded to previous therapy. And then you see the red part of a circle. That's the proportion of people who got MDMA who still had PTSD after treatment, and it's less than a quarter. So 3/4 got into remission. Whereas the light blue circle, you see the opposite. You see over 3/4 stayed ill. They stayed having the diagnosis. So the difference between the red and the light blue is profound, and it's such a powerful effect. It's likely to be clinically really very important. Next slide, please. We've been able to ask the question using brain imaging of how these treatments work. And this is the data we have on how MDMA works in PTSD. And PTSD is a disorder where the emotional response to a memory of trauma becomes overwhelming. And it's recently that the emotion of PTSD is located in a different brain region to the factual memory of the trauma. And that allows us to selectively deal with the emergent memory, the emergent emotions. And the therapy with MDMA therapy in PTSD is designed to allow people to re-engage with the emotional memory, but control the emotions. And often before MDMA, it was difficult for them to do that. They would often dissociate or faint or just run out of the room. But MDMA allows them to stay in the therapy long enough to get well. And the images on the right-hand side, the brain scans, show why. The blue blobs in the brains on the right are areas of the brain where the activity is reduced, suppressed by MDMA. And those blue blobs are in what we call the emotional center, the limbic system, the amygdala. And MDMA depresses activity in the emotional center enough for people to be able to stay in therapy and get better from therapy. So now we have an imaging correlate of the clinical outcome. Next slide, please. What about psychedelics? Well, psychedelics produce profound alterations in brain function, which is why they produce such profound changes in consciousness. But what's particularly relevant for the therapeutic benefit is that they change connectivity in the brain. And these two images on the normal brain under placebo, the psilocybin-treated brain, they've got the same number of connections, there's 7,200 connections in each. But you see under the psychedelic, the connections are much broader, much more across the brain. The brain becomes hyper-connected under psychedelics. And that, we think, allows people to understand why they get depressed, but also to come up with new solutions to how they might deal with their depression. And so this catalytic process that you heard Pedram talk about initially, these facilitate a path to recovery by giving people new insights into what they might do and how they might think differently. The next slide. The question is, do those changes which we see during the psychedelic state, do they persist subsequently? And this is a recent paper of ours which show they do. And we don't scan depressed people during the trip because it would be unethical. But what we have done is scan them after they've had their psychedelic experience. And we've shown that the brain is changed as a result of the psychedelic experience in a way which increases cognitive flexibility. So if you look at the bottom right-hand image there, you see the red lines going up. Going up means a more flexible brain. You're more able to change the way you think. And that occurs after psilocybin, but not after escitalopram. And the images at the top are just schemas which help you make sense of what's going on. The way we're conceptualizing disorders like depression now is shown in the top left-hand image. That's what we call the energy landscape of the brain. The brain is very differentiated in depression. You have deep troughs. And when people get locked into a deep trough, their thoughts go round and around and around with depressive content, but they can't escape from them because the trough is too deep. The middle image shows what happens during the psychedelic trip, which we know from studying healthy volunteers. The energy landscape of the brain is flattened. And that's where that increased connectivity came from in the slide I showed you previously. But we now know that persists. And we can see it 3 weeks after the last psilocybin treatment, there's still greater flexibility, a flattened landscape. And that flattened landscape predicts outcome at 3 weeks, and in one of the other studies at 6 months. So for the first time now, we can show a pattern of brain activity which correlates strongly with clinical outcome and helps emphasize the fact that what these drugs are doing is changing the functionality of the brain to make people able to escape from their depression. The next slide, please. And just a couple of quotes from patients, just so to sum up the kind of experiences they describe. My outlook has changed significantly. I'm more aware now it's pointless to get wrapped up in endless negativity. I feel as if I've seen a much clearer picture. My mind works differently. I ruminate much less, and my thoughts feel ordered, contextualized. Rumination was like thoughts out of context, out of time. Now my thoughts feel they make sense with context and logical flow. These descriptions are very common. Patients often talk about these drugs as if they are reformatting their hard drive or defragging the hard drive of a computer and allowing the computer to work more smoothly and more fluently. And that's what the brain imaging shows. It shows that their brains are more flexible. And just to finish with this quote from this philosopher and playwright, George Bernard Shaw, those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. Actually, we're now reframing that. We think psychedelic treatments change the minds of our patients through changing their brains. And the next slide. And what we need to do now, and that's why we're here today, is change the minds of many healthcare professionals, some politicians, and scientists about these therapies. We should bring them back into medical practice because we know they're safe and we know they're effective, but they're still very hard to access. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. I just would like to ask you a very quick question, because you said new solution to old problems. But actually, from the graph, the first graph that you showed with the surge of actually psychedelic use and psychedelic research in the 60s, 70s, it seems it's not that new. But how that period where intense research in the field was actually going on, how does that inform your work of today? And would there be any findings out there, any evidence that is helpful to you today?
Well, absolutely is. So that, I mean, one of the reasons it was easy to dismiss and to ban psychedelics was because no one knew how they worked. Now we've got brain science. It would be much harder for people to say, well, it's just some kind of myth. It's some kind of happy, hippie kind of trippy thing. So the science helps us now make it our case stronger. But the early data is fantastic. You've got 40,000 patients. You've got an analysis of many of them showing enormous safety, with levels, risks of psychosis, risks of suicide, much lower than people would have assumed. And I say to you now, never has a medicine ever been put on the market with clinical safety data on 40,000 patients. That's why I'm very reassured we can use this medicine, because we've got that historical safety data that bolsters we've got 1,000 current patients, but we've got 40,000. So we know it. The safety data is really very, very helpful to us.
So there is no more magic. And it gives a new light to this saying that science is basically responding to the educated guess for the last 400 years. So
yeah, but it's unfortunate. It's been 50 years since we've been able to do this. And that, there's hundreds of millions of patients who have been denied access because of the arbitrary decision to say they had no medical value, even though they did. And that's why it's a very inhumane. That decision was very inhumane. That so many people have suffered, and we still haven't brought it back. As I say, there's no country in the world that has yet rescinded the signature on the UN Convention.
Thank you, Dave. And I'm eager to move to our next speaker, and we shall certainly come back as we are collecting questions in the chat. And our next speaker is Anton Gomez Escolar. Anton, you're a psychopharmacologist, researcher, and author, and you're going to talk to us about the use of psychedelic-assisted therapies in substance abuse disorders. On to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's okay. I have a presentation. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the use of psychedelics in the treatment of substance use disorders. Next, please. I'm going to very briefly review a little bit the state of this field and the possible implications for future research and for implementation in national health services. So just to mention that we're talking about psychedelic substances that were formerly known as hallucinogens. These substances include psilocybin, LSD, DMT, mescaline, but there's also other substances with psychedelic properties like MDMA, ketamine, ibogaine. They are all considered to be like psychedelic substances, even though they are purely not all of them are psychedelics, but they all have psychedelic properties. No? So in the drugs wheel, we could say that we're talking about the substances in the area of empathogens, that is the yellow, the psychedelics, that is the green, and the blue part, that is the dissociatives. Psychedelic-assisted therapies are those that combine common psychotherapy with a psychedelic. And as it was mentioned before, the psychedelic is not used to minimize the symptoms of the illness. It's used to catalyze or to accelerate the efficacy of the psychological intervention. So in this model of treatment, we don't need to use a lot of substance. We don't need to give the person the psychedelic substance every day, as it is done now with all the antidepressants or anxiolytics. But in this case, we use it just in a few times, 1, 2, or 3. And the results of that intervention are long-lasting. The important thing about this kind of intervention is that it has to be given under direct supervision. So the substance is not given to the patient to take home. The substance is taken by the patient under the direct supervision of a therapist. The patient should have some preparation before the session, should have some monitoring during the session, and should have some integration after the session. So it's very different to how some of the current pharmacotherapies are used nowadays in mental health. Please, next. So when we're talking about substance use disorder, we're talking about a problem that is very important. So nowadays, there is 11.8 million deaths a year that are related with substances like tobacco, alcohol, and other drugs. And we lose 130 million life-adjusted years of disability, meaning that all the problems derived from the abuse of these substances make the society lose a lot of healthy and productive years of life in the population. Tobacco, just tobacco, is the single largest cause of preventable death worldwide. We're talking about 6.6 million deaths a year. Alcohol is responsible for 3.3 million deaths a year. So, huge problem. Not all of these deaths are related with substance abuse, but are. Behavioral addictions, on the other hand, it's a growing trend these days, especially after the pandemic and with the development of all new technologies, social media, pornography sites. So we're getting more and more behavioral addiction problems that also carry their own problems. Maybe not the toxicity of some substances, but they have a massive problem when it comes to this life quality loss in population. Next, please. So how can we use and how are we using psychedelics to try to treat these substance use disorders? In these headlines, we can see that in the last few years, we have been having some important news in this field. So we have New York Times talking about the next big addiction treatment. We have MNBC talking about the psychedelic drugs helping people with alcohol disorders reduce drinking. We have many other media talking about these results from clinical studies that we will review in a second. So to start with alcohol, there was a recent study published by Michael Vogelshuis in New York University with really good results in alcohol use. So in this case, they divide a group of patients with alcohol use disorder into two groups. One was receiving 2 doses of psilocybin, and the other one was receiving an active placebo to try to make them believe that they were taking the substance. So that way you can compare what's the effect of the substance just by subtracting the effect of the placebo. And in this study, they were all receiving 12 weeks of psychotherapy along with the pharmaceutical intervention. The percentage of heavy drinking days for the people that got the psilocybin was decreased very significantly. Yeah, and also the mean intake of alcohol of that people was also reduced compared with the drinking with the other group that was receiving the active placebo, showing that there is efficacy in these substances. So there is a lasting improvement in their alcohol intake habits, meaning we are decreasing the danger of this alcohol use disorder in these patients. Some of them also gain sobriety after the clinical intervention. Next one, please. There are also some other studies ongoing at the time with alcohol use disorder and psychedelics. There is one in University of Zurich. There is another one at Johns Hopkins University. Also some in Europe, like Copenhagen University on alcohol use disorder, and University of Iowa in the United States. When it comes to tobacco, the other big addiction or substance use disorder that we were talking about, there is a very interesting study being done in Johns Hopkins University by Matthew Johnson. It was published a few years ago, but the results are still very striking. So it's an open label study, meaning that in this case, patients knew whether they were taking the substance or no, they were not taking the substance. And in this case, 12 among 15 long-time smoking addiction people, so people having trouble stopping smoking with several failed attempts in the past, 80% of those were abstinent 6 months after the initial intervention. So in that time, there were no intervention. It was just single intervention with psilocybin, and the results persisted over 6 months for 80% of the sample. This is huge if we compare with the actual efficacy of the current treatments that are being prescribed for tobacco addiction, that in most cases are just 30% effective. So it's a huge efficacy. Of course, it's a very small sample, so we cannot extrapolate very solid data from this, but it's pointing to a direction. It's showing us that there is a big opportunity here in this kind of treatments for a very wide and common addiction that is killing 6.6 million people every year in the world. This same study had a follow-up at 12 months, and 16 to 13 months, go back, thank you. At 12-month point, 60% were still abstinent. Hadn't been smoking in 1 year after that intervention. And months to 30 months, 60% is still abstinent. So it's very long-lasting results for a very fast intervention that is only once in time. Now, thank you. So now there's more research going on in this specific indication, tobacco addiction or nicotine use disorder. Psilocybin facilitated smoking cessation treatment. This is the pilot study I was just presenting. There is more studies from Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine going on at the time. Next. And also to mention that these studies have gained a big grant by the National Institute of Drug Abuse from the United States, $1 million that are going to be increasing the speed of development in this particular field of addiction in the next few years. There's also studies with opioids. Yes, there's also some studies with opioids going on. Particularly, there's one substance that is called ibogaine that looks very promising for opioid addiction treatment. In Spain, there is a study with ibogaine for long consumers of methadone that were already made the transition among heroin to methadone, and now they want to stop methadone use. And by taking doses of ibogaine, they can make that transition way easier and with much more successfully, with really, really good preliminary results at the time. But also, psilocybin is being explored for this same indication for opioid use disorders. And also with buprenorphine, that is a similar substitute to strong opioids, like in the case of methadone was for heroin in the case of the Spanish study. There's also cocaine studies exploring the possibility of using psilocybin in particular to treating cocaine addiction with the same model as the one we were talking about, like interventions combined with psychotherapy that produce long-lasting effects and sobriety in many people, like in desintoxication, sorry. This one, for example, in University of Alabama, Birmingham. And also there is some private companies that are developing these substances for medical use. Some of them are already in phase 2 clinical trials, meaning that they're just one step before the medical authorization. Of course, the phase 3 is the most complex and long and expensive phase of the trial, but it's interesting to see that these treatments are proving efficacy and they are proving safety. They just need to prove that they can be accessible for bigger populations and still being safe and being effective in bigger numbers, no? But for example, we have alcohol use disorder, MDMA being explored for alcohol use disorder. We have psilocybin for alcohol use disorder as well. DMT-derived substances for opioid use disorder and another different substances, all of them like related with psychedelics. Of course, the thing when we're talking about private development is that there is regularly an interest in patentability. So they try to look for versions of the substances that have some patentability potential, meaning that there might be same efficacy with classic psychedelics, but of course the market is not going to be so much interested in these developments. They want to have some capacity to have some patentability in the previous, in the later, market distribution of the substances. Next, please. Just to tap in a little bit on the mechanisms, David Nutt gave an amazing introduction to this. Just to mention that in the case of addiction treatment, we can find that the substances, that psychedelic substances, have 3 different levels of action in the brain. So first of all, we have neuronal level, increasing neuroplasticity, making neurons a better reconnect with other neurons, making the brain more find more easy the possibility of changing the pathways that has been very established by repetitive use of substances or repetitive behaviors that are in behavioral addictions. Also, there is changes at the level of the networks, so at the level of the brain. So it reduces the amygdala activation. You have a reduce in default mode network activation. There is an area of the brain that is very important to deactivate in some mental problems like depression or addictions in this case, because it helps to change the patterns in the brain. It changes these pathways that has been established through years and years of pathological consumption. It acts like a reset button, as once featured in the media. It's a very interesting analogy. Also, there is this level of the phenomenological experience. So the patient is subject to that allows them to have a new way to see the world, a new way to see the old problems that has been battling with in trying to treat this addiction. And it also can bring this mystical experience, an experience that can be very profoundly insightful and have long-lasting changes in the way the person approach the surroundings, the environment, the other people, these substances or these other addictions. Next one, please. So why these psychedelic-assisted therapies might have a promising future for treatment of substance use disorder? As we were mentioning before, they are looking pretty effective, at least with the sample sizes we're having now. So we really need to explore this in bigger sample sizes, but we hope this is going to be the next step. And it also looks like the effects are very long-lasting. Maybe not forever, but at least lasting enough to make the patient go back to a normal life for a certain period of time. That probably is going to also help them to not go back to the same old habits and old addictions that were in a problem in the beginning. Also, they look that they are very safe, at least in clinical settings, because of course, outside of the clinical settings, we have less control over the variables of setting, the purity of the substance, the preparation of the participant. But in the case of clinical studies, we can have a very good control of these variables. They are non-addictive, they have a very low toxicity, and all these psychological risks that are often featured in media are quite manageable when the person is ready and is well monitored during the experience. Also, it looks that these substances could be very effective in the future for wider populations, for national health systems, because we have lasting effects with a very small exposure. We have those substances are cheap in general, and also they work for very debilitating and very incapacitating conditions, because addiction is a very incapacitating condition. So if we have substances that have any effect on this condition, we're going to have very big returns in quality of life, but also in social, in working capacity of these individuals, in taxes, in many other variables that can give back a lot of the money that we may invest in the development of these new therapies. Next one, please. So just a few conclusions and considerations for later the Q&A that we will have and all the chit-chatting about this topic. I think this is a very big opportunity for European research and development and also implementation. We can have very big public health returns if we implement these new approaches fast, and we have a good resource into the development of these substances and the research of these substances. Because a few doses of these substances under their supervision have fast and lasting therapeutic effects. And since the traditional business model is not so much interested at this point in the way this classic psychedelic might be working, because there is this problem of the patent of substances that are very old and are natural in many cases, there is this need of a little bit more of public funding that maybe in other pharmaceutical areas is not as needed as in this one in particular. This will never be, or at least it looks like it will never be, a take-home treatment. It's a treatment that is going to be given under supervision. It's not going to be sold in pharmacies, and it probably will be sold only in specific clinical settings with specific clinics and specific hospitals that have professionals that are used to it. So meaning that the safety profile of the substances can be even increased by the way the substance could be given or delivered to the patient. And the use of these specific therapies can also have great savings for the public health systems. So we're taking chronic patients, very expensive patients for public health systems, also having major losses in life quality variables, and we are helping them to transform into healthy subjects in a very fast treatment intervention and with lasting results. So this is really, really worth it to be explored. This is really worth it to be funded, and this is really worth it to be implemented in a future if this clinical research still show us that the efficacy, the safety, and the efficiency are the ones that we are seeing so far in the clinical research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anton. And we've got a few questions coming in, and I'm eager to be able to address them in our discussion afterwards. To complete this picture, I'd like to turn to Jan Ramakers from Maastricht University, and Jan give us the light on psychedelic-assisted therapies in neurology. Over to you, Jan.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me well like this? So psychedelic-assisted therapy in neurological conditions. That's a broad term, I would say, and that would encompass neurodegenerative disorders like dementia or Alzheimer, but also chronic pain like headache or cluster headaches or fibromyalgia. There hasn't been a lot of work in this area, but still there's a confidence that psychedelics may actually be effective in this realm as well. And I think there are two reasons for that. The first is the fact that we now know that psychedelics cause a neuroplasticity, so meaning there's more interconnection between neurons. And if there's a repair of neurons in pathways that are involved in neurological disorders, then from that, you could actually predict that, from a physical repair, there will be therapeutic efficacy. And second, for most of the neurological conditions, there's also the psychological component is actually also very important. Think, for example, about pain in general. Right? Pain thresholds differ between individuals. Some can take pain much better than others. So there's a psychological component to it, how you handle pain. And that is something that we now know we can actually address with psychedelics as well. Next slide, please. And this is not entirely new. So again, referring to the old days, back in the 60s and the 70s, if you dive into the literature, you'll find that within Europe, actually Italy, to my surprise a little bit, but also in the United States, there have been neurologists, psychiatrists that have been treating their patients with psychedelics. And the diagnosis of the patients varied a lot in terms of chronic pain. Either it could be migraine, sometimes people were suffering from pain related to cancers or pain because they were in a terminally ill state. Phantom limb pains have also been treated with psychedelics, in particular LSD, because this was like the prime psychedelic back in the days that was under investigation. And here again, what has been reported in samples that sometimes were small, like 6, but sometimes very decent, like 380, and anything in between, that single doses of LSD, varying in moderate doses to high doses, could actually relieve the pain of patients quite dramatically on the day that people actually took a psychedelic. But in some of the patients, that efficacy actually lasted over time. So even 3 weeks later, there was a report on improvement in many of these patients. So this is a very interesting and also, you would say, a stimulus to continue your research. But of course, that didn't happen because the UN gathered in 1971, which stopped most of the research. Next slide, please. But that again, as often is the case, you can prohibit drugs, but that doesn't mean that people stop using drugs. And that is also the case with patients who suffer from pain, right? If they don't receive any benefit from the traditional pain medication, they will look for other alternatives. And that's typically what chronic patients have been doing. Chronic patients, from a range of pain conditions. And the good thing about that is that you can question them, right? You can set up surveys because you're interested in what they use, what the dose that they use, how long they use, how they use it, and compare their subjective experience in terms of pain relief versus other conventional analgesics that are on the market. Because remember, pain patients do not decide overnight to go for a psychedelic. They would have tried everything that's already on the market. I could probably show you 1 or 2 slides with every compound that they've tried before they went on to a psychedelic. So we set up a survey like this. This is certainly not the only one. There are many more out there, asking them how great the relief of pain when using a high dose or a macro dose of a psychedelic, a low dose of a psychedelic, a microdose, and how that related to when they used a conventional analgesic. So here you see this, the results from that. So typically the relief of pain would be highest when people took a high dose of a psychedelic. That would be significantly better as compared to a dose of psychedelic, but a lower dose will still be more efficient than taking a conventional analgesic compound. And with conventional compounds, I'm referring to NSAIDs, but also to opioids, and also cannabis actually, and that was in that same category. So this is promising again. Next slide. And but if you read some of the old literature, people that were in a terminally ill state and who actually reported relief of pain, and you would ask them, would you like to have another 200 micrograms of LSD? They would often say no. Because they didn't like the psychedelic state and they preferred not to go in there. So one question that is really emerging in the field, and that is very prominent and relevant, I think, is whether you can actually replicate some of these analgesic effects with doses that do not actually produce that hallucination. So it sort of leave out the psychedelic effects while still being active on a pharmacological basis. So we were interested in this principle, and we set up a study together with the Beckley Foundation, where we invited healthy volunteers to go through 4 treatment conditions. So one was a placebo, and in the other 3 conditions, we gave them low doses of LSD, so 5, 10, and 20 micrograms. And these, particularly 5 and 10, would be doses that would not be noticeable. Right? You can take it, you can drive a car, go to the groceries, go to work, right? Nothing would notice, nobody would be able to tell that you are actually taking a microdose. So we asked them to come back to our lab in 4 days, and we wanted to test whether they could bear pain better under LSD. So we asked them to place their hand in a bucket of cold water, which is at a constant temperature of 3 degrees. Which is pretty cold. And typically you can't keep your hand in that cold bucket for a very long time. So we registered how many seconds people were able to keep their hand in the water. And apart from that, we also have some subjective measures. Next slide. So here we are looking at the data in the left panel, in the left upper panel, there's pain tolerance. So this is the number of seconds that people can stick their hand in the cold water. And we didn't, relative to the placebo, so these are the white bars, we did not notice any change after 5 and 10 micrograms, but we did notice that after 20 micrograms, people were able to keep their hand in the water for a longer time. And at that particular dose, we also, those participants also reported that the feelings of pain were less unpleasant and also less painful. So the objective change in pain perception was also supported by a subjective change of pain. Next slide. So yeah, we also looked at whether at these doses there was really no psychedelic effect. So were people really not noticing that they were taking a psychedelic? And well, there was some effect, but really very low that you particularly could see at the highest dose of 20 micrograms. But again, they were very negligible, I would say. Next slide. What we did find, and this is in this slide, is that there was an increase in blood pressure at any dose, which is a well-known fact for LSD. Nothing of clinical significance, nothing to worry about. It's all very much within the normal range. But we do know that the increments in blood pressure actually also correlate with analgesic effects at any time. So that's related to the bioreceptor reflex response. So we did a regression model to find out whether some of these perceptual effects or the blood pressure changes actually contributed to some of these pain outcomes. And they did, but they explained about 15% of the entire response. So they probably contributed, but it's not probably not the entire mechanism that we are looking for. And we know, for example, that the main receptor target, 5-HT2A, is actually well prominent also in the pain pathways. So very much it's likely that there will be a pharmacological mechanism as well. Next slide. Yeah, so but that's in healthy volunteers. But it's a kind of proof of principle that shows that no, there is an analgesic effect that you can even find at low doses. But then we need to make this step to chronic patients. And there are not many studies out there at the moment. I'll show you in a minute that there is a lot of interest in it. But so far, the clinical data out there is scarce. And there are basically conducted by Emanuel Schindler at the Yale University in the US, who looked at migraine patients. So that's the data that we're looking at here. So they received a single dose of psilocybin of 10 milligrams, which is not a high dose. It's a moderate dose, I would say, in 12 people. And relative to the baseline level and relative to the placebo treatment that they also went through, they reported that the number of days that days per week that they felt a migraine actually reduced after the single dose of psilocybin. And also the intensity of pain reduced similarly, as was the functional impairment that they experienced while doing day-to-day operations, like going to work, going to school, or things like that. So that was really the very first indication, I believe, that in chronic patients showing that a low to moderate dose of psilocybin can be actually beneficial acutely, but also on the longer term. And that same group also published another study in cluster headache just a couple of weeks ago. Next slide. So in a small sample, I must say, but patients with cluster headaches, and sometimes patients have cluster headaches that they experience, throughout an episode. But sometimes cluster headaches can be chronic. I've been talking to patients who tell that if they have a cycle of a cluster headache, it's hard to imagine, but that can actually last for 3 months. And they would report that with the treatment of psilocybin, they can actually reduce the cycle to a number of weeks, like 2 or 3 weeks, which for them, of course, is an enormous advantage. So these anecdotal data is all out there, but the clinical data is still waiting to be gathered. And this is the very first attempt in a small sample, so 3 patients that went through a placebo condition and through a condition where they had cycles of psilocybin, so just about 10 milligrams again, over a period of a year. And what they reported on average is that there was a reduction in the number of attacks that they experienced. So there was a reduction that was evident from the means, but if you put statistics on them, these did not actually reach statistical significance. And you can actually see also when you look at the bars that are surrounding the means, that are quite wide. So probably meaning that some benefited and others did not, which is what we expect. But in order to get a better understanding of who's responding and who's not, we need really larger sample sizes to conduct studies like this. Next slide. Yeah, so I looked at the American registry of now what are people doing, right, in terms of psychedelics, which studies are ongoing. And the pink line, I thought that was comforting in a way. That actually, that represents like fundamental studies. So academia-driven work that is just interested in psychedelics, looking at fundamental mechanisms of action and maybe also clinical responses. And then the yellow line is mood disorders. And that also makes a lot of sense. David talked about it. This is really the studies that are paving the way. And that's also the area where the most progress has been made so far. But you see that as the blue line, so headache, and also where's pain, that's the light blue line, these are actually, that are increasing. And if you search the web, you find that there are actually, I don't know, somewhere between 5 and 10 companies at the least that have an interest in pain as an indication, and that are developing formulations of psychedelics in the treatment of these indications. And they could focus on headache, but they would also focus on chronic pain, such as neuropathic pains, for example. So I think the field is opening up. The interest is there. The basic pharmacology behind it is not complete, but it's promising. And yeah, I'm expecting that in the next 5 years, there will be much more studies coming up with data in this field. Next slide. Yeah, and that brings me, I think, to my final slide. So, I mean, there's a lot of challenges still ahead of us, I think, in general, for the psychedelic field. But in terms of chronic pain and neurological disorders, you know, we need a lot of clinical trials to begin with, right? And they need large sample sizes. The other issue here is that, you know, how will we treat them? Do we need a single dose, or do we need to repeat it? And if so, then, you know, will there be tolerance developing? Which indications, do we have to go through for a personalized route? Because if patients, they would develop their own way of treatment, and some would take 10 milligrams, others profit only from 20. So there's a lot of variation in there. So I think tailoring to patient needs will be very important, particularly in this area. And of course, mechanisms of actions, you know, always important. We need to understand them much better. And then in the very future, you know, how do we implement these psychedelics in our healthcare system? And that's a problem that's not new to neurological disorders, but I think this applies to the entire mental health fields. And with that, you know, I would like to thank you.
Well, maybe Jan, to open the discussion, and on that particular last word you had in your conclusion, what would be for you the key challenge, but also the key solution in addressing this, let's say, implementation issue?
Yeah. Well, so we're talking a lot about psychedelic-assisted therapy, right? So the therapy is, of course, a very important aspect to some of the treatments and the indications. I think we should first have a discussion when this assisted therapy is actually needed. So I could imagine it's very, very important in the context of the treatment of PTSD and also depression, but it might be less important, for example, in the treatment of chronic pain. So I think we have to first have this discussion to when these assisted therapies should be used and should be implemented as part of the overall therapy. And if we do, I think we also need to prepare our mental health care system for that novel situation, because I think at least in the Netherlands, I know, Joost is here who could talk about it, the medical world is not prepared for a combined package where you just not only give a pill and treatment, but also have psychological assessments to go along with that. So that needs to be prepared, I think.
Thank you. I really wanted to push that a little bit further because we are in the European Parliament. It's time to come up with a very concrete policy ask to our host of today, but also his colleagues. And I'd like to come back to you, Anton, and to you, Dave. Do you share Jan's conclusions, and what would be your views on that, on, let's say, the readiness of our system in terms of the implementation of psychedelic-assisted therapies? Dave, you'd like to go first?
Yeah, as a psychiatrist, I see psychedelics as kind of putting the soul back into psychiatry, because the fact we have now tools to facilitate what psychiatrists do as well, which is, all doctors do psychotherapy, but psychiatrists are supposed to do it properly, professionally. And now with psychedelics, there's a real incentive to regain those skills and or even to expand them. So I think these are going to be really extremely exciting times for young psychiatrists. I think it's going to help recruitment into psychiatry, because I think young psychiatrists will see that there's a chance to be part of a new wave of intervention. So what we do need, though, is obviously an awful lot of education, because currently they're not being trained in this at all. They're learning about it on the side, and the big challenge is getting their teachers, the trainers, to accept that they want to learn and then pass the messages down.
I totally agree. When it comes to implementation, the biggest challenge is training. We need all the healthcare, people involved in healthcare, especially psychiatrists, psychologists, they want to know about these therapies, how they work, what they're talking about, because sometimes you hear this criticism for psychedelics talking about the possibility of, no, I don't want patients to be taking psychedelics everywhere. No, because this is going to happen in a very controlled environment, and this is very important for people to know that it's just single or very few exposures in a controlled environment by a very trained therapist that has all the important variables, setting, preparation, under control. And that is where the success in the long term is gonna be, in really controlled environments with very good preparation, very good training. And I agree with David that now, being a teacher in this is probably challenging, because you're gonna have this interest from a new generation of psychiatrists, new generation of psychologists, new generation of people working with the psychological part, the brain, everything, that are gonna be very interested in psychedelics, and we really need to fill that gap and to provide that training to the people that is going to be the future professional delivering these treatments to the patients in need.
Thank you, Anton. I'd like to repeat my call for any questions or comments in this part of the meeting. But as I don't see anyone raising a hand, yes, Sergio, go ahead.
Thank you. So thank you for your presentation. As an anesthesiologist, I think that chronic pain patients all actually react better to treatment when it is in a multi-modal form, adding exercising, psychotherapeutic aid, and so on and so on. So I do believe that even for chronic pain, framework of applying psychedelics within a psychotherapeutic or psychiatric context would be necessary, or at least, that's what we have on evidence without the psychedelics treating chronic pain. And the other thing that I was thinking about is about microdosing. I didn't saw the question mark about the safety of microdosing, since we know that it induces cardiovascular activation of 5-HT2-1 receptors and 2B receptors, which might lead to heart valve conditions that are irreparable.
So to start with the first question, so what we do see with any treatments of psychedelics is that at some point the initial effect wears off, right? And then the patient is confronted with the question: are there other means, alternative means that I can use to sort of sustain the therapeutic effect that I had? And in terms of depression, people may turn to yoga, mindfulness, running, all kinds of things that sort of connect them to the response that they had in the beginning. And I think something similar could also work with neurological disorders such as pain. And I think you gave some good examples of that. There is some evidence indeed that there is, particularly with LSD, there may be some cardiac problems, even with microdosing. We do not know how the frequency of that adverse events, and we also do not know how that actually would develop when people take it on a very frequent basis. So I think, yes, there's some ground for worry there, and I think we need to monitor any complaint in that area. But we need long-term studies to get a better understanding of the actual magnitude or clinical relevance of that problem.
Thank you, Jan. And Pedro, I would like to invite you to contribute to that part of the discussion. We have a question in the chat actually on the potential to launch a European Citizens Initiative. I won't go into detail of the technicalities of that process. But do you see there that from your perspective, there could be a kind of societally driven initiative to push for such options to be made available? What's your point of view based on the discussion we just had?
You mean for psychedelic therapy to be available? I mean, yes, absolutely. I'm all for it. That's probably why I'm here still. I think there's massive potential, but I just think what's missing the most is, like, even here being in this room, I just feel like most of the attention goes to how you do this, but really the voice of patient and the voice of participant is still missing. Like, you know, like I feel like I spoke 8 minutes and there's 2 hours talk about everything else. And I think until we can include more of these voices and these lived experiences, and also the challenges, is really, like, feel like with psychedelics, we're so much focused on solution, but I don't think we actually understood the problem enough. And that's one area that I'd like to see more. And the only way you do that is by doing qualitative research, by talking to people, by learning more about them, and the cultural aspects of it. So very much missing in the current treatments.
Okay, so actually you're setting the agenda for the next Paris meeting in this house then?
Yes, I would hope so, yeah. We need more of this, absolutely. Yeah.
No, absolutely. But I think, David, you mentioned ethical limitations in your presentation. I mean, from what Pedro is just saying, is there anything you'd like to respond to that? In terms of addressing the magnitude of the problem, if I understand correctly what you said, but also being able to deliver on these kind of expectations.
Well, I think the thing to say is we're in quite an early stage, and we've gone through, and yet we've only been going for 10 years, really, the modern field, and we've gone through a phase of enormous hope and hype, and now there's a lot of concerns as to whether there's actually enough resources even to take perhaps any psychedelic through to being sort of commissioned in a class as a regulated medicine. So I'm absolutely with Pedro, and the driver is got to be more than just the traditional model of IP and commercialization, and the patient voice is going to be critical in making all resources available, so that the hope doesn't disappear because it doesn't turn out to be satisfactory to companies. And we know, I mean, you know, there are very, very few, well, almost none of it, maybe none of the major pharma companies that still work in the brain space who are actually interested in psychedelic presence. And they're the ones that do have a lot of resources. And if we can't unlock those, we've got to find other sources. And, maybe the EU is that would be, a fantastic opportunity for them to step up to that.
Yeah, and we have another question in terms of availability of those therapies, and that maybe I'd like to jump in here. Practical question on how will Europe differ in terms of regulation and accessibility from the US, Asia, UK, Australasia, any countries? Do you have a view on that?
So I'll start with one thing that we have in common. That's how we approve these drugs, the regulation. There is FDA, there is EMA. So they are kind of gatekeepers. Now, Europe is quite different from the States in that we are, of course, very fragmented because countries have freedom to handle their healthcare delivery as they want, and it results in huge access inequities. So we are, first of all, we have to consider psychedelics in this wider context. What's also different in Europe is that unlike the US, when the drug is being approved by FDA, almost automatically, this will be somehow covered by private insurance. In Europe, that's not the case again. I think in Italy, there will be 8 out of 10 treatments approved by EMA will be available in Italy, and in Romania, 2 out of 10 on average. So huge differences again. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And this also has to do, of course, with the reimbursement landscape. We have these complicated health technology assessment bodies, which are looking at not just whether the intervention is safe and efficacious, but also they look at the value for money. So again, it's a very fragmented landscape. Every country has their own HTA machine. Luckily, the Commission is working towards bringing these different assessments together through the pharmaceutical legislation that will be finalized in the next few years on the Commission side, through the HTA directive from December 2021, when the Commission wants to create this coordination body, bringing together representatives from member states. So I think there are some real chances for us there to understand these processes and then to engage. And perhaps one idea that we have at PAREA is, as this HTA collaboration at the EU level is moving forward, we could have, so one of the collaboration schemes there is horizon scanning. And perhaps we could make a case to have psychedelic-assisted therapies taken up as a pilot by member states.
Thank you, Tad. And I would like to really convey an apology, because we need to bring this discussion and this event to a close. And I'm also conscious that MEP Duda needs to also continue his day towards other meetings and other activities. And I'd like to give him the opportunity to say a little word before having to leave. And before we run to the conclusion of this meeting. MEP Duda, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Please. Chcę powiedzieć, że to był dla mnie zaszczyt być dzisiaj tutaj z Państwem. Jako socjolog i polityk uświadomiłem sobie, że uczestniczyłem w niezmiernie fachowej dyskusji wśród znakomitych specjalistów, za co jestem bardzo wdzięczny. To jest dla mnie, jako osoby, która chciałaby się angażować w rozwiązania zarówno na poziomie europejskim, jak i lokalnym, czyli w moim kraju, w Polsce, niesłychanie ważne doświadczenie i jeszcze raz bardzo za to wszystkim Państwu dziękuję. Jednocześnie chciałbym złożyć deklarację, że jestem do dyspozycji w tej kadencji, a może w przyszłej, po to, żeby te istotne przyszłościowe rozwiązania mogły być tutaj wprowadzone na poziomie parlamentu, ale też w poszczególnych krajach członkowskich i będę do Państwa dyspozycji razem z moimi kolegami, którzy w tym obszarze też mają coś do powiedzenia, abyśmy wspólnie otwierali nowe ścieżki po to, aby pomóc tym, którzy tej pomocy potrzebują. Psychiatria zyskała duszę, panie profesorze, tak? Znakomite, zapamiętałem, bardzo dziękuję, wszystkiego dobrego, bardzo było miło z Państwem dzisiaj się spotkać. Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Duda. And actually, it's great to hear from you that the dialogue is taking shape and that we will have further opportunities to engage into this, and something is really moving as of today. So I'm really pleased to turn to my colleague, co-chair of, co-vice chair, I should say, of PAREA, Deirdre Ryan, who is the president of Pain Alliance Europe, for the concluding remarks of today. Deirdre, over to you.
Well, first of all, I'd like to take this moment to mark the milestone that is today and the initial support that we've already received from you, MEP Duda, and I thank you for that, and from MEP Salima, who couldn't be here today. We'll look back in years to come and remember that we were all here, that these were the first steps that were taken in introducing psychedelic-assisted therapies in Europe. We were before the FDA approval. We have the nod that the same will follow in the EU, and we have this unique opportunity to be ahead of the game. We can see the tide that is coming. We know the unmet need. You can hear from all the research that was presented today that psychedelic-assisted therapies are not only effective, they're safe, but they're efficient. But what we need to do in introducing this to a population is to develop the infrastructure for the highest quality, safe, affordable, and equitable access to these treatments so that they can benefit the greatest number of people in all conditions that involve mental health, chronic pain, neurological conditions, substance use disorders across the broad spectrum, and the many areas that are not investigated that may benefit from these treatments. So it's so important, as we've mentioned today, regulators aren't used to dealing with both the drug and the treatment. There's infrastructure changes that need to happen at the EU level, and we need EU support so that trickles down to the EU member states. And that's why we have our appeal. You all have it in front of you, where we've detailed what it is that needs to happen to make sure that this becomes success now, when we have the opportunity, before things become introduced in America and we follow suit here, we have the chance to shape it ourselves. And it's so important that this is a multi-stakeholder initiative, that the patients are central to this, that we ensure that their needs that are unmet at the moment are best represented by these treatments, that we understand, as Pedro is saying, which patients they're really best for. There's so much yet to be discovered, but we need to do this in a safe and approachable way across Europe so that it's not just in the top 5 countries, it's also in Romania. And this fosters competitive clinical trials to boost EU-based, EU culture, EU-funded research in this area to endorse these infrastructures and the structures that need to happen in healthcare, but also across other policy areas. Health doesn't only stay in health. There's the whole societal impact. It affects how we work, it affects how we get to work, it affects the environment, it affects employment, it affects justice, it affects our security and our borders and how that impacts on our health. And it is multi-policy area. And that is why we need the EU to lead on this. And we are here saying we have the information, we have the energy, we know the need is there, so let's do it. So in conclusion, the future is here. It may be disproportionate. We all have a part to play in moving forward. And may this be the catalyst, like psychedelic-assisted therapies, to shape the future. Thank you.
And on this note, I'd like to bring the meeting to a close. And as it was said brilliantly by Deirdre, the momentum is here, the time is right, and the dialogue is open. So please be in touch, convey any comments or questions to Parea, and we'll very happily respond. You know the men know whom to reach to. Thank you to our virtual audience for staying with us. And also thank you again for host of today, the teams of assistants who have been really helpful, the interpreters, the teams at Pain Alliance Europe, at the European Brain Council, as well as Tadek and James for putting all of this together. And see you at the next meeting. Thank you. Good afternoon.